Frances Coles came into the world on September 17, 1859, in a cramped little house at 18 Crucifix Lane, right in the heart of Bermondsey, Southwark. This wasn't the posh London of grand estates and tea parties. No, this was the working-class underbelly, a place where leather tanners, dock workers, and factory hands scraped by. Her father, James William Coles, was a 39-year-old bootmaker from Somerset, a man who'd once been a master of his trade, but was now just trying to keep his family afloat. Her mother, Mary Ann Carney, was 29, hailing from Armagh, Ireland. They weren't married, which wasn't unusual for poorer folks back then. Legal weddings cost money, and survival often trumped tradition. Together, they'd already had 2 daughters, Mary Ann, about 6 years old, and Selina Adelina, not quite 4. Frances was their 3rd child. A few years later, in 1862, they'd welcome a son, James Jr. Life for the Coles family was tough from the start. Picture it. A single room where James stitched boots by day and the family slept by night. The air thick with the smell of leather and sweat. Bermondsey's leather district was a hive of industry. Tanneries lined the streets, and the Thames nearby carried the stench of progress. But progress didn't trickle down to families like Frances's. They were poor, plain and simple, and every day was a grind to put bread on the table. We don't know much about her childhood. No diaries or letters survive to tell us if she played in the muddy streets or dreamed of something better. What we do know is that poverty shaped her early years, a quiet force pushing her toward a future she couldn't control. By the late 1870s, things took a darker turn. In September 1878, Mary Ann, Frances's mother, passed away. She was in her early 40s, worn out most likely by a life of hardship. Her death left James, now in his late 50s, to fend for the family alone. But he was getting older, his hands less steady with the needle and thread. The kids were growing up too, and starting to scatter. Mary Ann, the eldest, was already out in the world, and Selina wasn't far behind. Frances, now 19, and her little brother, James Jr., 16, were the last ones clinging to the family home. But it wasn't long before that home crumbled. By 1881, James Sr. had landed in the Bermondsey Workhouse on Tanner Street, a grim gray building where the poor and broken ended up when they had nowhere else to go. For a proud craftsman like him, it must have been a bitter pill to swallow. Frances, though, wasn't ready to follow him there. She struck out on her own, chasing independence in a city that didn't make it easy for a young woman with no money or connections. By her early 20s, she'd found work as a trainee in the packing department at James Sinclair Son, a soap and toiletries manufacturer at 65 Southwark Street. It wasn't glamorous, boxing up bars of soap and bottles of lotion for pennies a day, but it was something. She lived in a lodging house at 192 Union Street, a step up from the workhouse, but still a far cry from comfort. These places were crowded, noisy, and cheap. Shared rooms with strangers, thin walls, and a constant scramble for the next shilling. Around this time, she started going by Frances Coleman, dropping the S from Coles. Maybe it was a clerical error, or maybe she wanted a fresh start, a way to leave the weight of her family's struggles behind. Her next job took her to the Minories, a bustling area near the docks. She worked for a wholesale chemist, stoppering bottles, corking glass vials of medicines or tonics. It sounds simple, but it was grueling. She told a friend once that it hurt her knuckles, the repetitive motion grinding away at her hands. Victorian London didn't care much for workers' comfort, especially not for women like Frances. She was in her mid-20s now, still petite, 5 feet tall with pale skin, light brown eyes, and reddish-brown hair that earned her the nickname Carroty Nell later on. She was pretty, people said, with a quiet charm that stood out even in tough circumstances. But prettiness didn't pay the bills, and the chemist job didn't last. She walked away, her knuckles bruised, and her options shrinking. So, how does a woman like Frances, with a bit of work experience and a stubborn streak, end up in Whitechapel, the roughest patch of London's East End? The answer lies in the cracks of Victorian society. The 1880s were a brutal time to be poor, especially for women. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and if you didn't have a husband or family to lean on, you were on your own. For many, the streets became the last resort. Sometime around 1883, when Frances was about 24, she turned to prostitution. We don't know the exact moment it happened. There's no dramatic turning point etched in the records. But a man named James Murray, who knew her later, told police in 1891 that she'd been working the streets of Whitechapel, Shoreditch, and Bow for about 8 years. That timeline fits. It's a heartbreaking shift, but not a surprising one. Whitechapel in the 1880s was a world unto itself. Narrow alleys twisted between crumbling tenements, the air thick with coal smoke and despair. It was home to immigrants, laborers, and the unfortunate class, women who sold themselves to survive. Prostitution wasn't a career choice. It was a lifeline. A woman could earn a few pence in a night, enough for a bed in a doss house or a scrap of food, when factory work or begging wouldn't cut it. But it came with risks, disease, violence, and the constant threat of arrest. Frances stepped into this world, her red hair and soft features marking her as Carroty Nell. She wasn't loud or brash like some. Those who knew her said she kept to herself, avoiding the chatter of the other women. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was shame. Either way, she carved out a space in a place that didn't forgive weakness. Even as her life spiraled, Frances held onto threads of her past. She visited her father at the workhouse every week, Fridays, holidays, Sundays, like clockwork. They'd go to church together, sitting in the pews as if nothing had changed. She'd tell him she was still living respectably on Richard Street, that she'd left the chemist job for something vague but decent. It was a lie, of course, but a kind one. James didn't need to know his daughter was walking the streets of Whitechapel. She protected him from that truth, and maybe protected herself from his judgment. It's a small detail, but it tells us something about Frances. She hadn't given up on being a daughter, even if the world had pushed her to the edge. Now let's fast forward to 1889. Frances is 30 and she's been in this life for years. That's when James Thomas Sadler enters the picture. Sadler was a 53-year-old merchant seaman, a fireman on the SS Fez, tall, rough around the edges, and no stranger to a pint. They met somewhere in Whitechapel, maybe in a pub or an alley. He was a client at first, but their connection grew into something more regular. Sadler later said she was reserved when they met. Aloof, not one to mingle with the other women. He liked that about her, or so he claimed. For 18 months, he was away at sea, stoking the fires of the Fez while Frances kept surviving in London. When he came back in February 1891, he noticed a change. She'd slipped further down, he said. Thinner, maybe, or more worn, but she was still Frances, still keeping her distance from the crowd. February 11th, 1891. Sadler's back in London, discharged from the Fez with a pocket full of pay and a thirst to quench. He heads straight for the Princess Alice pub on Commercial Street, a rough joint in the heart of Whitechapel. There's Frances waiting or maybe just passing through. They lock eyes, and it's like old times. He calls her Jim, a nickname just for them, and his mates know him as Tom. They share a drink, then another, and decide to stick together for the night. It's a cold, damp evening, the kind that clings to your bones, but the pub's warm, and the gin's flowing. For a moment, it's almost normal, just two people finding comfort in a hard world. The next day, February 12th, they're still together, and the drinking doesn't stop. They bounce from pub to pub across Whitechapel, a blurry haze of ale and spirits. By 7:30 p.m., they're staggering drunk, and Frances has an idea. She takes 2 shillings and 6 pence from Sadler, half a crown, and heads into a milliner's shop at 25 Nottingham Street. The shopkeeper, Peter Hawkes, remembers her clearly. She's 3 sheets in the wind, he says, slurring, unsteady. But she's got her eye on a black crepe hat. It's nothing fancy, just a simple thing to perch on her red hair, but she wants it. Sadler's outside, peering through the window, watching her fumble with the coins. She buys the hat, puts it on, and they stumble back into the night. It's a tiny moment, but it's hers, a flicker of joy in a life that's had precious little of it. Later that night, around 11:30, things start to unravel. Francis, still drunk, shows up alone at a lodging house on Thrall Street where they'd crashed the night before. Sadler's not with her. He's out on the street, and trouble finds him fast. A woman in a red shawl and two men jump him, rough him up, and snatch his watch and money. Francis sees it happen from a distance, but she doesn't step in. Maybe she's too drunk, maybe she's scared, or maybe she just doesn't care anymore. Sadler's furious, spitting mad that she didn't help. They argue, voices sharp in the cold air, and then they split. He storms off, bruised and broke, while she disappears into the shadows. Sadler's not done yet. He ends up selling a blunt knife to a lodger for a shilling and some tobacco, a desperate trade to keep himself going. That knife's going to come back into the story later, so keep it in mind. As for Frances, she's out there alone now, her new hat tilted on her head, the night closing in. It's February 13th, 1891, just past midnight, and the clock's ticking down to the end of her story. It's the early hours of a cold winter night, and Whitechapel is quiet. Too quiet. The bustling markets and crowded tenements of the day have given way to shadowy alleys and dimly lit corners. One of those corners is Swallow Gardens, a narrow passage tucked under a railway arch near the London docks. This wasn't a place you'd wander into by accident. It was a known spot for prostitutes and their clients, a secluded, dangerous haunt where quick transactions happened out of sight. For Frances Coles, it was familiar territory. She'd been here before, likely looking for a client to earn a few pence for a bed. But this time, she wouldn't walk away. Around 2:15 a.m., Police Constable Ernest Thompson was patrolling alone for the first time. He was young, just 26, and eager to prove himself on his first solo night shift. As he walked near Chamber Street, close to Lehman Street Police Station, he heard something. Footsteps, fast and fading toward Mansell Street. He swung his lantern toward the sound, but the darkness swallowed whoever it was. Then, as he turned back, his light fell on a sight that would change his life forever. Frances Coles, crumpled on the ground, her throat slashed, blood pooling beneath her. She wasn't dead. Not yet. Her eyelids flickered, one eye opening and closing as she struggled to breathe. Thompson stayed with her, bound by duty to protect the victim and secure the scene. He couldn't chase those fleeing footsteps, a choice that would gnaw at him for years. By the time help arrived, Frances was gone. She died on a stretcher en route to the London hospital, her life slipping away in the frigid night air. Word of the murder spread fast, reigniting the terror that had gripped Whitechapel during the Jack the Ripper killings 2 years earlier. The press jumped on it, speculating that the Ripper was back. But let's look at what happened that night. Earlier, Frances had been drinking with James Thomas Sadler, a 53-year-old sailor with a rough reputation. They'd argued, and Sadler stormed off after selling a blunt knife for a shilling and some tobacco. Frances, now alone and desperate for money, likely headed to Swallow Gardens. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon, examined her body and found she'd been thrown to the ground. Wounds on the back of her head suggested a struggle. Then, with her chin tilted back, her throat was cut 3 times deep enough to sever her windpipe and arteries. Unlike the Ripper's victims, though, there were no mutilations, no organs removed. Just a brutal, efficient kill. The police zeroed in on Sadler. He'd been seen with Frances hours before her death, and when they arrested him on February 16th, he had blood on his clothes. He was a volatile man, known to carry a knife, and the public was quick to label him not just Frances's killer, but possibly the Ripper himself. The evidence seemed damning. Witnesses confirmed their argument, and that sold knife raised eyebrows. But Sadler had a story. He said the blood came from a fight earlier that night. He'd been robbed by a woman in a red shawl and 2 men. Witnesses corroborated the robbery, and the blood matched his own injuries, not Frances's murder. The timeline didn't help the police either. After their fight, Sadler was spotted at pubs and lodging houses, scrambling for cash. By 2:15 a.m., when Francis was attacked, he was likely elsewhere. Without solid proof tying him to Swallow Gardens, the case weakened. Supported by the Seamen's Union, Sadler was acquitted on March 3, 1891. The magistrate ruled there wasn't enough to send him to trial. The public fumed, convinced he'd dodged justice, but legally, the evidence just wasn't there. So, if Sadler didn't kill her, who did? The shadow of Jack the Ripper loomed large. His 5 confirmed murders in 1888 had left Whitechapel scarred, and Francis's death fit the pattern in some ways. A prostitute, throat cut, same neighborhood. But the differences stood out. The Ripper mutilated his victims savagely. Francis's body was spared that horror. Experts today largely agree her murder wasn't his work. The method, the timing, the lack of escalation, it doesn't align. Still, in 1891, with fear fresh and answers scarce, it was easy to wonder. So who was Frances Coles beyond the headlines? She was a woman shaped by hardship. Born in 1859 to a working-class family, she'd tried factory work and shop jobs before poverty pushed her into prostitution. She was quiet, reserved, and fiercely loyal to her father, visiting him weekly to keep up the facade of a respectable life. She found joy in small things, like the black crepe hat she bought with her last coins. Her murder at 31 left her story unfinished, but it didn't erase her humanity. Her case went cold. No one else was charged, and the killer's identity remains a mystery. Yet Frances became more than a footnote. She symbolized the countless women of Victorian London trapped by circumstance, their lives deemed disposable. Her death closed the Whitechapel Murders file, but it opened a window into a world of inequality and danger that still resonates today. Swallow Gardens still stands, a quiet relic amid modern Whitechapel. Standing there, you can almost hear the echoes of that night. The footsteps Thompson couldn't chase, the last breaths Frances took. Her story isn't just about a murder, it's about a life, a struggle, and a society that failed her. So let's remember Frances Coles not as a potential Ripper victim, but as a woman who deserved better, a name worth saying, a story worth telling.